Welcome back to the channel. This time I would like to explain to you how to write a table that is using dynamic components and therefore can be used in general. You have to write it once and you can use it whenever you like on your system. To do so, I have already prepared certain things. So to have a table in general is a bit more complex. I have this simple table column. A simple table column consists of a title, a name in data, which is just a reference to the data set, and then dynamic components. Also on the table, I have prepared certain things. One is like an array of table columns. I call them for the moment simple table columns. There is table data, which is in principle anything or any array you want to insert into the data. It usually is an array of objects, which means it's not an array of single values. You can do that, but it's not common. It's in JavaScript, it's an array of objects, and I will tell you what that means in just a second. And then I have already prepared certain things or certain methods that I will explain later on in this video. They're just there for simplicity, and so it does not take too long to completely write the code. So now on the start page or component that I have also already prepared certain things. One is the table data that we're going to inject into the dynamic table column. This is just a list of actors and the movies, or like at least one movie they played in. And we want to get a table that consists of those specific actors. So inside the table, usually in HTML, I'm using HTML tables, not any grid framework at the moment. There is usually a tr with th, those are table headers, and then there is a tr with tds, and these are the table contents. So for the table headers, we actually loop over the table columns. So every table columns gets a specific cell, and in the table header, the thing that we want to show, my mistake here, is let column of table columns. So we're repeating ourselves, we're looping over the table columns, over the entirety, and inside the column there is a title which we want to give out. And then in the body, we actually have to do the same thing, but on the TD. So we need the same amount of TDs as we have THs. And in here, then we would like to give out sort of the content of the specific value in our array. But we're getting to that soon, because now we're actually looping over all the columns that we want to display, but we also have to loop over all the elements in the array. So in here, I also go for ng4, let entry of table data. So this thing here is the x-axis, and this thing here is the y-axis of the table. And we have already defined the table header on top. So now in here, under normal circumstances, I would actually go for the we have defined the array. So depending on the column I'm on, I actually just want to get sort of the table data followed by whatever attribute we're choosing to show in the specific table. So in the TD cell, first we go to the table data, or more specific, the entry, table entry, or array entry, data entry, and then we have to get the column dot name in data out of it. And so if I do that, it would actually just generate the table sort of from the data we have. And just to show you that this actually works, I would like to go over to the start page, and next to the table data, I would also like to define the table columns. So go with this punct, this dot table columns, that's an array, and I declare a new simple table column, and the simple table column already has a config object that it takes over in the constructor, and currently those are all optional attributes, so I need a title and a name in data currently. So I have this object here, and I would like to go with title. That's like first name, and then the name in data is the same thing, but not in capital letters. So I take over the first name here. So, and with this configuration, I already am able to define everything I need for the table. There's the movie and the movie. And if I save that and I go back to the page, currently fails to compile. I have to figure out why that is the case. Must have just okay. Yeah. So it tells me that in the table thing here, name data is optional, so the entry might also be optional. So I just go back here, and in case it's not defined, I also have to do it here for the moment. This compiles, so we go back, and in theory, nothing shows. It should show the tables, but that's not the case. I have an assumption why this happens. On the start page, I have declared the table, but I have decided not to hand over the properties. So the table columns, I just hand over the table columns, and the table data is the table data. So we're feeding, again, like with the drop-down, we're feeding the table from the outside, and therefore the table columns that are displayed and the table data is fed from the outside. And so we have sort of created an abstract table that can be declared from the outside, finally be declared from the outside. So now I go back, and I already have like everything I want, but the content by itself is not dynamic. So again, I would actually like to declare a dynamic component, maybe a simple shared text click component. And in here, I can do that. I can add a dynamic component. This is a new dynamic component. And I have to import this thing here, and I go with a shared text click component. Again, in here, there's a component type. So there's the shared text click component, and I can feed it with whatever is inside the array. So, and here lies the problem. So there's two ways to enter data into the dynamic component. So the first one is like a fixed value. And if I just type, if I on this specific place type in like movie, and I assume it's the reference to the movies inside the array. So if I think it's a reference to here, then that's not the case. And the reason for this is we're currently creating a shared text click component, and we statically hand over the text movie. So what happens is that in our in our table, there is we currently have not used the dynamic component. We have not put that in. But now it would actually, instead of referencing the movie, it would actually hand out the text movie. And this would be shown in every single cell of that specific column. So when I'm going back to the HTML, this one is only valid actually if I just put a div inside and I go with ngIf, and then I go with column dot, and there is like a dynamic component, and I just go, if this thing is not set, then I would like to hand over the plain text that I'm having. This one, this reference here that we have written before, is also false, because if there's a complex object, I can actually just go to the first level. So if it's movies.a, I would not be able to actually access that with this specific thing that I've done here. And then I go in and I say, if the dynamic component in here is set, and I just Boolean wise make sure that the dynamic component is available, then I go with the dynamic component. And in here, I need to set a dynamic component. And as I said before, I have already prepared certain things. So I would like to use the get dynamic component that I'd used before. I have to hand it over the column, and the second parameter was the data, so the row. In this case, it's the entry. And entry is actually not the best of a name. The row is much better because it's the row of the table, or well, it's the data for the row of the table. So I just hand over the row. I just rename it row. And the get dynamic component, what it does is we have declared a dynamic component on the start page, but it's inside a simple table column, and it's only a template for every column entry that we're going to have. And if I'm inside the table column, I have to copy that template and create a new dynamic component. So I'm creating a new dynamic component that I'm returning on the page, and the dynamic component just copies over all the data, like module type, component type, inputs and outputs, that is on that particular entry. And then to really get the data that is inside the array, so currently what I have done before is I have set the inputs, and now I could actually go to the table, and what it should do is it should replace the first line with a shared text click component that says movie. And this is not what we want. So we want to actually reference the data that is inside the array. This thing is also really helpful if, as an example, you have an attribute that is handed over by the URL, something like an ID or a genre ID or something, and this is a link, and you need to use the genre ID in the link, and it's always the same thing. That would be a good thing. So some of the things that we hand over are fixed, and some of the things that we hand over need to be referenced from the array. And so next to the in the table declaration, next to the dynamic component, there is also a dynamic component row input values. And this thing is just an array of key value pairs. So I go with a new key value pair, and the key value pair, first thing in here is sort of the reference in the dynamic component. So as an example, text, that would be from the shared text click component. And the second one is the key of the array that we want to hand it over from. So there's a key value pair, text and movie. Text is the one on the shared shared text click component, and the movie is a reference to the movie in the table data. And because I had overwritten this, I can actually delete it, but we also know that the shared text click component, as an example, has an emit value. And maybe I would like to override this, and the emit value now is a string of movie. So we're getting back to that, or just to be able to keep those apart, I just call it movie2. And then same as before with the dropdown components, I declare outputs. And I have to quickly look what this is called. It's called text click, or click the text, and I go with this dot click the text. I need to define this thing, and I declare another event emitter from the Angular core. And then this .init, I also have to once again subscribe. And I go with this dot clicked text dot subscribe. We're getting handed over data, and I would just write that out again on the console. So, and we're done. So yeah, now I have put in the dynamic component raw input values, and this is just a mapping from the dynamic component attribute text to the table data movie. So if I go back now into the browser, I already see that the expandables is now the dynamic component inside our table. And if I click this one, I get movie2, and this was the static data that I get out. And that's basically it on how to set up a table. As I said before, I might go through the things that I have inside the table component. So this thing then makes the mapping from the dynamic component raw input values, sort of from the dynamic component to the table component. And the get attribute from object is a mapper that actually handles the sub-objects that I have mentioned before. So if I just wanted to give out like the row value here, that would be fine. But what I can also do is go in here and use object get attribute, object service get attribute from object. And if I would go in here and write this out, then like the data is the row, the cell name is the column name in data, and if empty content was just an additional parameter, that if this thing defaults to undefined or null or whatever, it should actually give if empty content back. And this fails to compile, I assume, because I'm not allowed to enter the object service directly. But in theory, this should work. I have to go with, yeah, No, the reason is that the column name in data might be empty, so I just hand over an empty string. In case this is not set, this compiles perfectly now, and we're still having the same thing here. Difference is that if I would have on the start page, I would have something in the data that is like, goes like A, and then in here B. I just put that in on every movie I have. Too bad. Then I can put in another column that would have name in data A.B. And now it should put in another row that just says ADSF. So with this, I can actually access more complex objects that would have not been possible before. Yeah, this is about it. In the table columns, obviously, you can now start to add specific attributes. As an example, if you click on the table header, you could put in sorting of some sort. What you can also do is if the table column has an hidden attribute. I know it does not work if I have ng4 and ngif on one line, but just as an example, I could go with column dot hidden. So I could actually hide specific columns. Then there is also an option as an example that you could create sort of a line underneath for content that belongs to that specific row that you can expand or collapse. That's also another thing that you can put in. Next to sorting, you could actually enter paging, where you limit the output of the table data to, let's say, 10 elements, and then put a paging mechanism in here down below, and then on a click, put like the next 10 elements into the table data array. That's also another thing that you could do. And yeah, with this, you can easily expand the table. And it's very useful because if you want to style the table in a specific way, you only have to do it once. If you change the CSS layout, it's changed on every other page. So this works really well. One limitation that we encounter from time to time is just if the table data array gets too big, maybe more than about 100 to 300 elements, depending on how many dynamic components are inside the table rows, the columns, excuse me. It's possible that the table just renders too slowly. So it's not something that you can use in every specific use case, but it's definitely something that massively helps you reduce the overlay. And if you have a junior developer that does not really know how to use tables, it's more easy for them because they just have to hand over array and the table columns declaration, and you're already done. So your developer does not need to explicitly know CSS, just makes things much more easy, and also very fast to set up once you have that, because actually yeah, you just have to write a table columns declaration, get the table data from your backend API, just hand it over, and you're done. Works like a charm. So thank you very much for listening. And the next element that I'm going to talk about are forms. Thank you very much, and goodbye.